If you've been watching my reviews for a while, you know that it takes very little to convince me to give a game a try. I was in a Discord chat talking about games when someone mentioned that there was an FPS clone of Resident Evil 1 on Steam. Seeing as how I've wanted more games similar to the classic Resident Evil games, I jumped on it pretty quickly. Honestly, I'd much rather have more tank control based survival horror games, especially if they're new, but I'm at the point where if it's survival horror and it's good, I'll take it. From the start, Nightmare of Decay instantly reminded me of the 90s FPS Blood. Despite never having beaten the entire game, something that I plan to correct within the foreseeable future, I got to play it back when I was around 6 or 7, and it must have made a big impact on me because those memories are still crystal clear to me. The connection between Nightmare of Decay and Blood is shallow, seeing as how both games start with you waking up in a coffin, but it still made me happy to see that. It really depends on your point of view, but I like it when modern games go all out to recapture the overall aesthetics or even the atmosphere of a bygone era of games. Some might be as blunt as to say that Nightmare of Decay is a bad-looking game, but I actually liked its rough-looking appearance. It's because later on the game would feature historical pieces of art, and that created an interesting contrast. Some might think, why do portraits in the game look better than the game itself? But I didn't worry about that. Much like with the first Resident Evil game, Nightmare of Decay's tone isn't as set in stone as other survival horror games such as Silent Hill 2. It definitely has disturbing moments and it's a violent game, but I loved how it started off by casually describing a zombie holding a decapitated head in your living room. That made me wonder if it was a sign of things to come, and rather than thinking that this game wouldn't be taking itself seriously, I was reminded of Evil Dead 1 and 2. The idea being that those movies knew how to balance comedy with horror. I wouldn't go so far as to say that Nightmare of Decay is a humorous game, but there definitely are instances of dry humor. Besides the sometimes rough-looking visuals of Nightmare of Decay, the same could be said of the voiceovers that were used. It's difficult describing these occasional moments as voiceovers because the reality is that they're weird-sounding voices. I could see why conventional voice actors wouldn't be used, but at the same time, it fits the overall vibe it's going for. It's kind of how some games will feature demons or other creatures that are hideous to look at, but for some reason they have the most pleasant-sounding voice and that creates a disconnect. This really could have just been a cost/time cutting measure, but if it works, it works. Being that this is an FPS, I expected it to run like other typical first-person shooters. That's one of the reasons why I was caught off guard by how it ended up feeling and controlling. You can run, but at the pace you can, you'll still get hit. Alongside running, you can also dodge, but it ends up feeling awkward, and rather than having the ability to awkwardly dodge, I would have preferred being able to crouch. It's not as if I expected to be able to take critical shots or shoot off limbs, but at least it would have been more reliable than what was available. For the most part, I like to think that the more options a game has to offer, the better off you'll be. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. Even if the classic Resident Evil games had a system of letting you know how much health you had, both in-game and in-menu, Nightmare of Decay has it so that it's always displayed, and I was left asking myself if that took away from the experience. It's because the point of this game is to pretty much recapture what playing Resident Evil 1 was like, but this health meter being used in-game changes things. In later Resident Evil games, your character would show whether or not they were in fine, cautious, or danger condition, but that wasn't present in Resident Evil 1. I might be making a mountain out of a molehill, but I bring it up because it changed things for me. As a result of constantly knowing how much health I had left, I would either play it safe or take risks. With this being a survival horror game, I'm not surprised that conserving ammo is a huge part of it. What surprised me was how quickly I found the pistol. I know that in Resident Evil 1, Jill starts off with the pistol and Chris finds it within 5 to 10 minutes of starting to play as him, but for this game, I would have had it be found at a later time. It's because finding 2 weapons back to back seemed like a bit much to me. In this game, it was like less than a minute. That's eventually balanced out due to the fact that it's easy to run out of ammo. It's a bit strange recognizing that this is an homage to Resident Evil 1 while also taking it for what it is, an FPS computer game. As a result of that, I was left wanting to customize how I organized weapons. I liked being able to assign them to specific numbers on the keyboard, but at the same time, I would have liked having been able to cycle through them, kind of like how it's done in Half-Life. This left me wondering if that was done on purpose to have you play in a manner that's closer to Resident Evil, or if it was just overlooked. This might come off as a nitpick, but I definitely felt held back by this during some of the more hectic moments of combat. It's both surprising and unsurprising to see that holy water can be used as a weapon in Nightmare of Decay. What really surprised me is that it's probably the strongest weapon. I was amused by this not only because of the concept itself, but also because using it was more like throwing a grenade. Despite thinking that it was strange using holy water, I quickly got accustomed to using it. Eventually, I was able to get through the giant spider boss fight thanks to using it and the shotgun. A strong weapon in a game is a good thing, but there's always the possibility that it may be too strong, and you want to avoid that. This was most noticeable when I'd have enemies gang up on me, and yet I could easily rely on the holy water. I'd get rid of crowds of enemies without much effort, but then I was left thinking that was too easy. With how effective the holy water was, it really wasn't necessary to use dynamite as often as I thought I would. It's because the dynamite took too long to explode, whereas the holy water exploded on impact. Much like in Resident Evil 1, there's a decent variety of enemies to fight against. At first, I wasn't expecting that many enemies to deal with, but in the end, it was the right choice. It's not only because this kept me busy, but also because it made it so that I'd regularly have to balance out knowing when to run, take damage, or fight. After all, this is a survival horror game. Unlike in Resident Evil 1, unlocking new parts of this game's mansion didn't lead to more enemies popping up in old areas. I know that this game isn't Resident Evil 1 and that I should judge it for what it is rather than for what it isn't, but seeing as how the basic concept is to recreate the experience of playing Resident Evil 1, part of me was expecting that. As I mentioned before, Nightmare of Decay features a decent variety of enemies to fight against. Not only are there zombies and other monstrosities to deal with, there are also cultists. Though I did have some issues with enemies here and there, I thought that fighting them was a rough experience. It's not because they were hard to beat, but because fighting against them felt clunky. You just stand there and trying to shoot felt really stiff. On the bright side, it took less ammo to take them out, but due to how movement worked in this game, it was easy to end up wasting ammo. It might be wrong of me to compare Nightmare of Decay to Half-Life 1, a game that influenced many people, but I was left thinking that despite having enjoyed this game, it's weird when games from the era they're trying to emulate work better. What I mean is that combat in Half-Life is way more fluid than in Nightmare of Decay. You could say it's because despite both being FPS games, they're different subgenres of games, but my complaint still stands. I could go on and on discussing all of the enemies that were part of this game, but it's easier for me to just bring up the ones that most stood out to me. Some of the boss fights were memorable, but it was usually for a wrong reason. The Soulsborne games feature boss fights that are exhilarating not only because of the skill and attention to detail that's required to overcome them, but it also helps that they usually feature great music and visuals. In Nightmare of Decay, the Chainsaw Cycle took me multiple attempts to overcome, but it wasn't for the same reason as in Soulsborne games. In Soulsborne games, you usually live, die, and repeat that cycle over and over again until you're able to beat whichever boss you're fighting, but in Nightmare of Decay was completely different. It's because the Chainsaw Cycle would usually only let you get one shot in before you were instantly killed. It was only after numerous attempts that I realized that I had to shoot at its back and learned how to make this fight easier to deal with. Much like how I once approached the classic Resident Evil games, in Nightmare of Decay I liked clearing all of the rooms floor by floor. It's because it featured too many doors, which I found to be intimidating, but also because I didn't know where to start, and I didn't want to end up disoriented. Thankfully, a map was usable, but even then, it was still easy to get lost when thinking of having to backtrack from one location to a distant one. You could envision the area in your head and recall where it was, but sometimes the path wasn't as clear as it could have been. This is especially true when it came to later areas of the game, such as in the basement. At first, it's maze-like down there, but you then get around easily and do what needs to be done. More proof of this was when I ended up going the right way by trying random doors when I had no idea where to go next. Chances are that how the area was laid out made it so that some areas just seemed right whereas others didn't, but all I really have to go with is my own experience. Though there were some areas of the game that confused me and took much longer than I would have liked, on the opposite end of the spectrum were areas that seemed too straightforward. Seeing as how Nightmare of Decay is heavily inspired by Resident Evil, you'd think it'd require more twists and turns in regards to what needs to be done. That's how it was in some areas, but others, much like the dungeon, came off as too simple. On the bright side, parts of it reminded me of Resident Evil Village because there were areas that also seemed to be flooded with blood. Whenever someone brings up pacing, people automatically assume that the person's referring to how a story's told and whether or not it's too fast or slow. For Nightmare of Decay, it had more to do with its gameplay and how some puzzles were too easy to solve. In the early sections of the game, it's clear that you're trying to find coins that are similar to the crests that are necessary to get out of the main mansion in Resident Evil 1. I'd say it's pretty well done in Resident Evil 1, seeing as how you're required to go throughout different areas of the mansion while engaging with different tasks, but it wasn't like that in Nightmare of Decay. Long story short, I didn't expect to find all of the necessary coins one after the other. This made me think that the game would be like 3 hours long. It ended up taking me nearly 6 hours to beat, and that's about the average length for a classic Resident Evil game, so I really shouldn't be complaining, but what I'm getting at isn't how long something takes, but how it's set up for you to get it done. The saying quality, not quantity, comes to mind, but I shouldn't be surprised since this game wasn't very expensive. The point isn't to say that cheap games equal a cheap product, especially when there are games out there that are like Terraria, but there really aren't many games out there that offer as much as they do at a great price, much like Terraria. I bring this up as an issue that I had with the game, but on the other hand, I thought it was nice when one solution led to many other things being taken care of. It was kind of like a domino effect, but with puzzles. If you're as into Resident Evil as I am, I'm sure that you've experienced moments where you're stumped and have no idea what to do, only for one solution to quickly push you in the right direction. This was best seen with you acquiring the spade key, which led to the square crank, and then some necessary chemicals. Due to how the game was laid out and some of the notes I found, I assumed that getting to the basement would be the end of the game. You can't really blame me for that, seeing as how most Resident Evil games end in very similar locations. I wasn't disappointed when I found out that there was more left to be played, but things could have been handled differently. The notes you found definitely helped to flesh out the story and made you aware of what happened at this house before you got there, but I ended up feeling misled by them. You might be thinking to yourself, is this guy reviewing Nightmare of Decay or Resident Evil 1? The reason I brought up Resident Evil 1 as often as I did is because of the nature of this game. It's incredibly obvious which games influence Nightmare of Decay, and there's nothing wrong with that. I regularly think to myself that you should really only judge something for what it is rather than for what you'd prefer it to be, but sometimes games or other forms of media are responsible for leaving you with different expectations. At the end of the day, what matters is that I enjoyed most of what Nightmare of Decay had to offer, and I feel that I got my money's worth. Is this the kind of game that I'll be replaying on a regular basis like I do with the classic Resident Evil games? No. What I can say is that if you enjoy survival horror games as much as I do, this game is worth giving it a try. If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for watching.